I can't believe we're here. This is the last week for A Weapon of Magical Destruction. Oh my goodness. I can't believe how fast this has gone by, but you know what? I have enjoyed doing this every week. It has been so much fun reading this to you. And I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I mean, that's, kind of the main reason I did this. But I have placed a poll in my reader group on Facebook. I'll put the link in the notes at the end of the show. If you are not part of that Facebook group, definitely join and put your answer in the poll on what you would like me to read next, because I've had so much fun doing this that I want to do more, more readings. And if you want me to continue with this series, then we will continue with this series. Or if you'd rather I read from one of the other ones, we will do that. But we have a lot of material to get through today, so let's get started. We are on chapter 30. We've got about 4 chapters, but they're kind of short. So that's why I decided just to lump them all together and just finish out the year strong. So let's do this. Chapter 30. The ride back to A.S.S.E.T didn't leave enough time for Sage to mentally prepare herself. She hadn't fully committed to the idea of Ava being on the wrong side, but being short of a decent list of suspects left them grasping at any shadows. I don't like this idea. Losing your nerve? Gray joked, but even he had a worried edge to his words. Sage fixed her hair after pulling off the helmet. If we're wrong, we look like idiots. If we're right, could be even worse. She didn't say that bit out loud. God forbid it be true. But isn't that what's expected of us? Clearly practiced at the art of deception, Gray wore the mask of indifference well. We are A.S.S.E.T's flunkies. You're the flunky? I'm a newbie, Sage said defensively. With the battle scars to prove it, Gray pointed at her bandaged neck. You might want to wear a scarf or something. She reached a hand up, gently grazing the massive bandage that was covering her wounds. How was she going to hide it? No one wore scarves in the middle of summer. Leaving her hair down, that wasn't an option. She could hardly stand clothes sticking to her with the heat. Thousands of strands of hair? Nope. That would be unbearable. There was no hiding it. She'd just have to wear the bandage proudly and deal with the fallout. Matt is going to kill me when he sees this. What's your deal with him anyways? Why? You interested? She giggled, hoping to get a rise out of him. Not my type. Is anyone? No, Gray replied flatly, slicking his hair back and putting the stupid fedora back on his head. Touchy about that, are we? Relationship troubles? Was that stony exterior cracking a bit? Could there be a little humanity beneath the asshole-ish exterior? If not, she could at least enjoy some fun poking at the bear. Lonely? Broken-hearted? Either one explains your don't. Not exactly what she'd been aiming for, but her offhand remark had reached Gray's soft underbelly. It was definitely raw. Okay, sorry, I was just... No. You weren't just anything. I'm not your friend. I'm your partner. That goes as far as our mission, not personal lives. But you just asked me about Matt. So much for a little friendly ribbing. You live with him. He could cause trouble for A.S.S.E.T. because he cares about you, romantically or otherwise. Gray's words were matter of fact, but she saw through them. If he didn't want to talk about it, fine. But she wasn't, she wasn't buying his pretense of being all about the mission. Sage adopted his grim tone. Matt won't be a problem. See that he's not. They entered the elevator and rode it all the way up to the top in silence. Rena was there, sitting at the reception desk, smiling, when she saw Sage emerge. They moved me out of the dungeon, she said, and then caught sight of the bandage on Sage's neck. Oh, hell! What happened to you? Rena rounded the corner and was at Sage's side in a flash, inspecting her bandages. Are you okay? I'm good. It's all good. Sage shied away from Rena, feeling uncomfortable having someone so eager to invade her space. We've got some news to report for Ava. Director Williams. Sorry, Masters. Where is she? Are you sure? I think you should be checked out in the infirmary. Rena shook her head, reeling in, excuse me, Rena took her by the hand, reeling her in for further inspection. I just want to make sure that it's not bleeding. No, I'm fine. Sage twisted away, breaking free of Rena's grip. We really need to talk to Ava. Battle scars, Rena? You know all about them. If you did some field work. Gray's comment worked to pull the attention away from Sage, who used the distraction to make him the middleman and avoid being pulled in again. I have been out in the field, remember? Rena's tone soured. Gray shrugged. Rena lifted her shirt. Through a thin layer of gauze, a wound, red and raw, and recently stitched, ran across her belly, still swollen and puckered where the skin was working to heal. Her chest was bound tight with medical wrap. Fresh enough wounds for you? She sneered at him. I'm not meant for field work, but I have tried. You should be proud to have battle scars. We all earn them. Want to see mine? He winked. Gray was a terrible flirt, if that was actually flirting. It almost seemed as if he were playing at it, a caricature of what he thought flirting should look like. Rena didn't seem to be buying it either. She rolled her eyes and retook her position behind the desk. You're going to have to wait a bit. Ava's on a major conference call. With the desk as a barrier, Sage felt safe closing in to talk. Do you know what it's about? Rena might not have reacted well to Gray, but she perked right up when Sage spoke to her. She cupped her hands around her mouth and whispered, Assistants know everything. Really? Sage wondered aloud. Well, we have to. I mean, how can the boss do her job without adequate help? So many details to remember and schedules to keep. She bristled with pride, aiming her cocky gaze at Gray. He didn't seem to care what Rena was saying. His attention remained locked on the office door, as if waiting for it to open. Ava might be hard to work for, but the things she handles are really important. Rena might not have done much field work, but Sage had no doubts that she had battle scars from dealing with the director. As many weapons as that woman kept in her office? It's a good thing she has you, then, Sage said politely, realizing that her question had gone unanswered. She might know things, like whom Ava was talking to behind closed doors, but that didn't make her a blabbermouth. Doing my part for the cause, Rena shrugged bashfully. Us too. I can't believe you went out to see those vampires. Rena sounded horrified again. Sage's hand found her bandages. She cringed at the memory. They are so dangerous. Rena looked pitifully at Sage. Does it hurt much? She must look like a weakling, babying her wounds. Sage took a steadying breath and let her hand fall back to her hip. I'll be fine. What happened? Rena asked. They didn't want to talk. Still mad at us, I guess. Sage shrugged. Rena's expression turned to sadness. I'll bet. So many attacks, people dying. It's horrible. She sounded as if her father had died all over again. Sage could see the tears in Rena's eyes. She wasn't much of a hugger, but at that moment it was all she could do to avoid looking at the poor girl suffering in front of her. Rena accepted the hug willingly, wrapping her arms around Sage's neck, and Sage winced with pain and pulled back. Her wounds were still tender, even with the bandage. Before Rena could apologize, Ava's door opened, and the Queen Mother herself glared from the doorway. Report. Sage breathed a heavy sigh, steeling her resolve to deal with the director and hold her tongue. Gray filled in with Sage close behind. She gave a passing nod of solidarity to Rena before closing the door behind her. Ava strolled around to her desk and sat. She folded the screen of her laptop down. Sage remembered Zach's words and looked for the mark of the tree on Ava's wrist. It was there, surrounded by the lacework tattoos, like gloves covering her hands and arms, just as she expected. But below it, she noticed another marking. Well? Ava demanded. What does that mark mean? Sage asked, staring down at the strange design. Was it letters? Numbers? Runes, dear, she replied impatiently. It's the mark of my position and age. Have you not seen similar ones on Mark Sorensen? In truth, no. Mark always wore a watch on his wrist with a big fat strap. Yes, that would help to avoid stupid questions, I guess. She snorted. The first real smile cracked her lips. amusement at Sage's expense. But I want to know about the vampires. I hear they weren't very friendly. What was your first clue? Sage mumbled under her breath. Gray cleared his throat. The Major Covens are pretty mad that we assaulted them. As was evident by their attack on us, Ava waved her hand around as if to say, get to the point. But we think we know why. Gray let his words hang, and the director's eyes glittered with interest. Go on. The artifact that came through here a little while back, apparently some kind of a weapon was employed and then lost. You've mentioned it to me before. Ava's eyebrow lifted sharply. Have you finally learned what it is? Yes, and we know where it'll be. He slid a paper across the desk. They tried to kill us, so I thought it only fair to return the favor. When the dust settled, I spotted this little note. They had found it, and were hoping to learn the way to use it against us. Ava scrutinized the small scrap of paper. This is where it is? Where it will be, Gray corrected. I have one of our friends retrieving it. If you know what it is, then you know how dangerous it is. Ava's tone turned cautiously optimistic. Sage here has been doing her research, Gray replied with a nudge to her shoulder. Touching the object is the danger. So long as it's encased in something, preferably silver, it's harmless. Sage met the director's eyes, adding weight to her words. Ava crumpled the paper in her hands. Who else knows about this? Gray shook his head. Only the four of us. Four? Ava asked. Who is the fourth friend? Didn't you see the address? Someone we all trust. Gray replied. I'm having him hold on to it for a few days until the vampire's rage dies down, and then we can move on it again. I knew I sent the right agent on this job. Ava nodded at Gray approvingly. With all due respect, Gray's jaw tightened. Ava's approval had clearly failed to give him the same pride as it did with Rena. You sent us on a suicide mission. No one knows the vampires better than you, with all due respect. Queen Bitch came back strong as ever. So much for her feigned approval. You should have been better prepared to deal with them. The way things are headed, we're on the brink of war, Gray replied. Wars are fought on battlefields. Ava locked eyes with him. This is a test of wills. As angry as he looked, Gray maintained his monotone. Where lives are at stake, when are lives not at stake? Her tone sharpened. The vein in her head made itself known, throbbing with the speed of her anger. What do you think our job is here? No one appreciates the law until they need the law. According to them, it is we who need to be policed, Gray answered grudgingly. Are those your girlfriend's words or yours? Ava shot back at him. Sage's mouth dropped open. Gray had a girlfriend? And if she'd followed that conversation correctly, a vampire girlfriend? That explained a lot. She filed that under questions to ask later, when they had more time for her to annoy him, until he told her the story. If she were alive to speak them, yes, I believe they would have been her words. Gray's voice warbled slightly, and the strain of trying to maintain the calm in his voice apparently cracked his resolve. She'd be right. Ava's lips tightened. If only Sage had a window into that woman's mind to see what she was thinking. One moment she was a royal bitch, and then a moment later she came across as a competent leader. There was just no true way to measure whether or not she was genuine. We have much to correct in our operation. Most importantly, we need to retrieve what has been misappropriated. All in good time, Gray said, the calm returning to his tone. Is that wise? Ava asked. I prefer it here, under A.S.E.T's protection. We've already come under attack. The vampires are all riled up. They expect us to bring it home when they notice it's gone missing. This is safer until we neutralize the threat, Gray assured her. And while we lie in wait, you must be seen operating business as usual. Yes, to that extent I have to agree with you. Ava's eyes twitched. Boss lady clearly disliked being ordered around. The more people who know about this, the more danger it becomes. Ava's tone might have been all business, but there was an underlying edge of strain in there. That item should have never been tampered with from the start. When you have deemed it secure enough to return, it must be brought under the utmost secrecy. Gray nodded. Our mutual friend has always been a trusted extension of the team, which makes him a liability. Ava's resolve wavered. She tapped her tattooed fingers nervously on the desk. He's very well known, well connected. That changes things a little. You can order me to bring it in now, Gray dared her. But I know the vampires are planning another run at us. Look at how easily they came at us the last time, throwing our own people at us. Our mutual friend might be well connected, but he's also extremely capable of defense. Ava sighed deeply, the vein in her head still throbbing furiously. Stress kills, but does it kill a Terra? Was Ava really a Terra? You, Miss Cynwrig, are you okay? Ava sounded almost genuinely curious about her health. I'm good, she shrugged. Nothing I won't recover from after a day of rest. Go home, take your rest, Ava ordered. And Gray, until further notice, you are her shadow. Stay with her. Gray nodded. I'll let you know my decision regarding our mutual friend shortly. Ava waved them off like a pesky fly and reopened her laptop. Dismissed. Chapter 31. Delivering the message had been surprisingly easy. Sage had expected a little bit more pushback from Ava. People in control often struggled with not having it. All the more reason for her to be a suspect. Ava would make sure she got her hands on that stone before anyone else knew about it. And if she were secretly something other than a Terra, they'd have her. The hard part would be waiting, holding her breath until the suspicions could be confirmed. Sage needed a distraction, or she'd drive herself crazy. We going to talk about the elephant in the room? She asked Gray as they left Ava's office. Gray took the lead, putting his back to her, walking like a man on a mission to avoid any conversation. Nope. A vampire? Really? She tried to process the shock of that information. We're not doing this. Gray passed Rena at the reception desk and headed towards the elevator. We're going to take you home to collect your belongings. But I don't want to move here. Sage made a good show of pouting angrily, realizing what Gray was doing to aid in their quick getaway. I have a home already. Listen up, newbie. That bandage on your neck is proof you can't be left alone, and I'm not going to babysit your ass out in the open any longer. Gray pressed the button for the elevator and took hold of Sage's arm with his free hand. If she didn't know better, she might have taken his overwhelming act of dominance seriously. Her knee itched to give him a taste of just how capable she was of defending brutes like him. But that would be taking things a bit too far. Be nice to her. Rena came trotting up, looking equally ready to start a fight. Being new sucks sometimes. At least she understands, Sage grumbled. Gray all but rolled his eyes. You'll thank me when you're older. It won't be so bad. Rena tried to look hopeful as she reached a hand to pat Sage's shoulder. When you get back, I'll hang with you. That was a small gesture of solidarity that almost made Sage feel bad for her deception. Rena had been nothing but nice. She was probably the only person at A.S.E.T who hadn't tried to manipulate her or talk down to her. They even shared a common grief, both having lost a parent recently. But since Sage and Gray had agreed that everyone with an A.S.E.T was a potential suspect, even Rena had to be kept completely in the dark. The elevator doors opened, and Gray shoved Sage inside. She gave Rena a silent look of sorrow before the doors closed. Gray didn't say another word until they reached his motorcycle. I hope we did the right thing. Definitely not what she'd expected to come from the usually arrogant mouth. Mr. Asshole suddenly going soft. You getting cold feet now? She asked. No, he scoffed, but she saw straight through his pride. Gray avoided eye contact as he retrieved his helmet. I'm hoping we're wrong to suspect. We're not wrong to seek the truth, she cut him off, annoyed by his wavering tone. Remember, that weapon is dangerous in the wrong hands, and if those hands are inside this building, we're all screwed. This isn't a damn game, you know, Gray shot back at her. We're playing with real people and real lives. Ava's the director of this facility. Was my mother playing a game when she was destroyed? Believe me, if I could just roll the dice and resurrect her, I would. I'm sorry for what happened to her. All the more reason we need to find out if Ava can be trusted. Sage fisted a hand at her side to give her strength. Ava controls everything here. That kind of power can be used for good or evil. We still don't know where the weapon is. Gray's tone lacked confidence. Ava's alliance is moot if it's in the wrong hands right now. If only he knew the truth, but Sage was not about to reveal that nugget of information, not just yet. Ava might be the primary suspect, but anyone attached to A.S.S.E.T could still be a mole. She hoped that the small amount of trust she'd given Gray was not misplaced, but until all was revealed, her lips would be sealed on that subject. It's why we have to know who to trust in this organization. If Ava's as good as her word, she won't let on to anyone where the weapon is. We can explain ourselves after we're certain she can be trusted. But if she so much as sets a foot in Devon's gym, then we know A.S.S.E.T's compromised at the highest level, and it's better we don't have the weapon at that point. They rode fast, making it back to the gym in record time. Nyx, sporting a calming shade of lavender, flitted around Devon's office, casting her magic in every corner of the room. Deadly as she'd learned the pixie could be, Sage still stood in awe as she watched the explosion of color knitting themselves into a tight webbing that encased the room. A small part of her wished that she could use magic, pull whatever she wanted from the very air and bring it to life. During her dungeon raids, she would often be the one casting healing magic, but occasionally she enjoyed a good damage blast. Her imagination could conjure up lightning bolts or green fog, but the glittering specks that Nyx tossed around were far more beautiful than anything she'd envisioned. If she couldn't use it herself, at least she was able to watch. Devon came out from the back of the gym, clipboard in hand, and immediately began doling out instructions. Make sure the doorway isn't blocked. We want our burglar to enter and feel as if they've made their way through our defenses without a problem. Once they break the seal to my office, that's when they need to be blocked. I want them trapped there. Devon gave a quick nod to Sage as he continued onto an electrical panel by the door. Karn had a bag of tools and sat clipping wires and running cables from an outlet to a small box he'd fixed in the wall outside of Devon's office. Looks like you've been busy since we left. Sage admired the new security system being installed. To keep illusions, we're rigging some alarm boxes and a new key code for my door. Devon handed the clipboard to Karn. Key code? Karn nodded and tapped some numbers in from the page that Devon had just given him. What do you need us to do? Gray asked. Go, make yourself comfortable in the back. I've set out some cots and stocked the fridge back there. We might be in for a long haul. The work Devon had put in was pretty impressive. The place definitely looked more secure, though she wondered exactly how much was needed for this hoax. Devon held a silver ring box in his hand, a decoy for our thief. Inside, it held a small garnet gem. He'd gone to great lengths to make it appear believable. All they needed now was to see if Ava would take the bait. What do you want me to do? Sage asked. Nothing. We have it in hand. Go home. Tend to your wounds. Devon replied, pocketing the little silver box. Licking them, she scoffed. No way in hell was she going to be benched for this. It had been her idea from the start. I've come this far. I'm not turning back now. Can't blame me for trying, Devon smirked. But one day, you will learn to heed warnings. Today is not that day. If you end up dead, as long as we're not facing vampires again, her hand moved to the patch on her neck. The look on Devon's stole the sound from her voice. Her heart nearly came to a screeching halt. No one said anything about involving those jerks. She made that comment as a joke. Why hadn't anyone thought to let her in on that part of the plan? They were only supposed to find out who was after the stone. Bringing in the bloodsuckers meant retaliation. If vampire covens got involved in this, Sage sucked in a breath. The image of her mother going dark again flashed in her memory. Her instinct was to plead for Devon to change his mind, to send the vampires away. But, just as she wouldn't allow herself to be sent away, she knew begging Devon would be futile. Why vampires? 32. Zach was the last person she hoped to run into, but he was a far better choice than the other Twisted Sister reunion. When he arrived to represent the vampire covens, Sage found herself a little relieved, though she wouldn't dare admit it aloud. She'd seen what vampires were capable of. Tough, as she pretended to be, Sage still had a lot of learning to do, and if she hoped to hold her own in another fight, Zack, however, had a reputation for being the least lethal of his kind, though he did have an amazing level of overconfidence, and those dangerously hypnotic eyes. Night wore into day and back into night again, with not so much as a solicitor coming to call at Devon's gym. Waiting was the worst kind of hell. Binging on reruns of old movies would be the best way to pass the time, but Devon didn't even have a television. She tried reading, but as close as mythology came to epic fantasy, the plot just couldn't hold her interest, and definitely needed more dragons. She started to regret not returning home when her wounds began to itch. The tape at her neck caught her hair every time she moved, and between the boredom, discomfort, and severe lack of sleep, Sage was ready to snap. She couldn't remember the last time that she'd had a nice hot shower either. Showers always made the world more tolerable. Hours blended together, and she wondered whether or not the plan had worked. She'd been uncertain about Ava's position, and if she was the person who could be trusted. Surely, having not attempted to take the weapon itself was a credit to her worthiness, but how long would they wait before giving up and coming clean? Scratching at her neck again, Sage remembered to send a message to Matt. Not knowing when she'd return home, she kept her words vague, making sure that he understood she was safe. Vampires might be scary, but nothing topped her roommate when his claws came out. Zack's eyes wandered in her direction as she tugged at her bandage. "Don't even think about it," she threatened the hungry-looking vampire. "As you wish." His lips drew back, not quite a snarl, but still an obvious attempt to put his teeth on display. "You seem afraid." Sage glared at him. "Not of you." "Is that wise, I wonder?" He mocked her openly. "How do I kill him again?" Sage threw the question to Devon. He had been pacing the lounge like a caged animal for the better part of the afternoon. The wait was putting a strain on everyone. More than once, she'd caught Devon muttering to himself, discussing backup plans and fail-safes as if confirming on a checklist. "Play nice, you two," Devon glared at Zack angrily. "I'm not playing," Sage rolled her eyes. "He's sitting here looking at me like I'm his next meal." Zack leaned in close and whispered, "You are most certainly an acquired taste." That sent a shiver down her spine. Goosebumps erupted all across her skin, and she remembered his finger tracing through her bloody wound just before he licked it clean. Ugh, disgusting. The smile blooming across the vampire's face turned fear into anger. He was screwing with her head, and it was working. Two could play at that game. Sage put every ounce of anger into her face as she replied in a deadly whisper, "Say something like that to me again, and you'll be drinking your next meal through a hole in your neck." "Will you two shut up?" Gray groaned loud enough to stop Sage from adding more to her threat. Gray had been lying with his legs stretched across an old pleather futon, his fedora covering his eyes. Zack responded before Sage could summon a good comeback. "I remember thinking the same thing about your last girlfriend." Gray's hat fell as he sprang to his feet, machete in hand, ready to strike. Sage ducked out of the way as Devon jumped in between the two men. "Is this how it ends? We fight each other until there's no one left to fight the true threat?" Devon was right, of course, but she did wonder who might win between the two of them. Zack had been called a pushover more than once, but like everything else she'd been told, the truth didn't always match up. Gray was quick, but she had a feeling Zack might surprise them all. Gray sheathed his machete, but the look on his face said he'd rather put it somewhere else. Zack folded his arms, turning his annoyance toward Devon. "Waiting, waiting, waiting. This is pointless. We know the weapon came from A.S.S.E.T. Why are we trying to get them to come here?" Devon returned to his pacing, offering no response to Zack's petulance. The lounge just behind the gym wasn't large enough for more than a few strides in either direction. It had all the necessities to keep them safe and close while they waited to see if anyone took the bait. After the hours of waiting, the walls felt like they were closing in on them. Any longer, and they would really come to blows. "Your people attacked A.S.S.E.T already," Gray reminded Zack. His tone was no less angry, but the look no longer held. But he looked. Blah, blah, blah. I can read. His tone was no less angry, but he no longer held his blade ready to strike. "Not my coven. Not me. You, of all people, should know that. My kind are very much independent." Zack replied, insulted. But you were the one to offer us information, Sage added. Little as that had been. At great personal cost, too, Zack rounded on her. The only reason I'm here is to get back in their good graces. And how exactly? Sage asked. Honey, there are things you should not know. His tone turned deadly. His cold eyes came within an inch of hers before she had time to register his movement. A viper masquerading as a worm. He had them all fooled by his personality, which allowed them to take him for granted. She had his number now, and would not soon forget the lesson he'd just given her. His warning meant death for whoever it was that dared come after the bait they'd laid. Although she was standing close, she could feel his cold breath on her skin. Zack's eyes weren't on her. He was staring at the bandage, a thin barrier between him and a fresh wound. Could he smell her blood there? She gulped at the knot that was suddenly blocking her throat. Still wearing your silver necklace? Zack jabbed a finger towards her chest. Her hand flew up to her neck, fingers seeking the chain. You don't like silver, do you? Zack scoffed and backed away slowly. Silver doesn't bother me as much as that tree. Terras aren't your enemy. The words flew from Sage's mouth on instinct. Your murderer is not a Terra. Zack said the words to Sage, but his tone was loud enough to be a reminder for the whole room. They're pretending to be one, though, and they know the secret to the weapon that can destroy magic. That it must touch its victims? Sage replied, trying to hold back the trembling notes of fear. So how did we wipe out a whole coven? One painful death at a time, as far as I was informed. Zack resumed his pacing, and that's exactly how they will be paid back. That was not something she wanted to see. Death, more death, too much for one lifetime, and yet she knew there would be more. All the angst and pacing in the room only made the tension thicker. They needed to take their minds off revenge and murder, at least for a few moments, or they'd end up killing each other from sheer boredom. She struggled for something to say to change the subject, maybe bring a little lighter tone to the conversation, but she came up empty. Devon returned to his muttering, and Gray pulled out a whetstone and sat on the futon sharpening his machete. And Zack paced around, eyeing everyone like a hungry cat. An unspoken truce of avoidance, not entirely comfortable, but safe all the same. The lights went out, sending them into shocking darkness, and Sage's heart skipped a beat. Had Ava fallen for the bait? With the power gone, the alarm systems were rendered silent, but they had magic on their side too. Nyx had long since left, but the barrier remained strong. The office was a magical rat trap waiting to be sprung by anyone not of Terra lineage. Patiently, they waited in a lounge just behind the gym, listening at the walls for the intruder to go to work. The door unlocked and opened with barely a sound. Whoever it was had skill. Next came the office door. Sage heard the small scraping sounds as the lock was carefully picked. As tempting as it was to jump out and stop them, the group remained silent, waiting for the trap to be sprung. The true test was whether or not the interloper could pass in and out of the barrier. The one who had used the weapon was not a Terra. Sage's heart ticked double time, as if racing the clock. Seconds felt like hours, eternity trapped in the bubble of a few precious minutes. A woman groaned loudly, her voice angry and afraid at the same time. Zack, followed by the hard slam. Her voice angry and afraid at the same time, followed by the hard slam of a fist against walls. Devon, Zack, Gray, and Sage rushed for the door, as if there were a prize for one of them. For the first one of them who earned... I can read, I really can. As if there was a prize for the first one of them who learned the intruder's identity. The front door had been propped open for a quick escape. The office door was gaping as well. Inside, the woman's grunts and groans of frustration quickly turned into demanding shrieks. Let me out! Sage emerged the winner, first to the office door, eagerness having superseded her judgment. This was the person responsible for the death of her mother, the one who had started the violence that had them all teetering on the brink of war. Her eyes met with a haughty glare, condemning as much as it were pleading for Sage to let her go. You can't do this. You have to let me out of here. Chapter 33. Rena? Sage gasped the name in horrified shock. Ava was supposed to have sprung the trap. The woman who'd been nothing but a bitch, who had placed them in danger with seemingly no concern for their well-being. Not Rena. She'd been kind. No, this had to be a trick. It's not what you think, Rena pleaded, her fists banged against the shimmering barrier Nyx had created. How? Why? Sage could hardly put two words together. Rena had been a cheerleader for A.S.S.E.T. She had tried to convince Sage to stay and see the good that they did. How could she not be one of them? She wasn't Tara. That was about the only thing clear to Sage. You betrayed us all. Sage watched Rena continue to test the barrier, pounding on it with her fist and then palming it in places as if searching blindly for a way through that she couldn't see. Why? You don't understand. Rena's eyes went wide as they lifted over Sage's head to the others behind her. They're murderers. The vampires killed my father, and your mother, too. A low blow, well struck. The pain of Miranda's loss was still fresh in Sage's mind, but not revenge. Rena, however, looked as if she'd strike at Zach if the barrier weren't there. Either her hatred was that strong, or she was something stronger. But that didn't make sense. Only the Terras were immune to the magic of the seed. How is she not one of us? Sage turned to Gray, hoping that he'd have some answers. Her father was, Gray shrugged. He didn't look as shocked as Sage felt, but the confusion pulled at his brow, creating lines that gave his ageless face a little history. She had the mark. I don't understand. Sage's eyes fell to the leather strap on Rena's wrist. Beneath it, the round canopy of leaves peeked out from the edges of blue leather. But Zach said it was false. Ink. Like the tattoos all over her arms. Why tattoo yourself with our mark? I wanted to be like him. Rena dropped the silver box as her shoulders slumped. My dad was the most amazing guy. He was the best. An agent like your mom, Sage. Every time someone mentioned Miranda, Sage's heart ached, pain that passed sadness as it twisted into anger. Her mother wouldn't have died if she'd been able to finish her mission. She suspected the stone had been tampered with. She'd given her life to protect it. Don't you dare mention my mother, Sage snarled. I'm sorry. I know it hurts. I miss my dad, too. Rena sounded so genuine, but how could she be? Did you know what he was? Sage's mother had never said a word about being Tara. Her work had been a secret. Sage would have never known her magical lineage if not for Gray ruining her happy existence with the truth. Your father was a Tara. Dad always told the best stories, and I suspected there was more truth to them than he let on. Rena stared straight at Sage, her eyes pleading for understanding. She spoke as if they were the only two in the room. He made up the best stories about the great tree. She pointed to her bracelet. I loved Dad's tattoo, and the nobility it represented. The nobility he represented by wearing it. Rena sniffed and wiped away the tears that were forming at the corner of her eyes. Rena might as well have been telling Sage's story. It rang with so much truth. She, too, had tears welling up in her eyes. Miranda had often told great bedtime stories about fantastical creatures and dangerous battles between good and evil. Magic was always woven into her tales, and when Sage had whined about the deformity of her birthmark, her mother had tried to make Sage feel that same pride that Rena spoke of. But those were just fairy tales. Did you actually know that he was... Not exactly, but I suspected. Rena cleared her throat. I was always good at drawing, so I made a template of his mark, and then I had a tattoo done while Dad was away on assignment. Sage had spent her entire life wanting to wipe away the deformity, covering it up with clothes or makeup, and here Rena was claiming to have proudly added it to her body. Dad was furious and made me cover it up. He gave me this. Rena held out her bracelet, the one Sage had thought was a brilliant idea. He never thought it would cause me any trouble, and he never thought he would get hurt, but I guess one day he didn't come back. When they came for me to tell me about his death, they saw that I too bore the mark of the Terras. Sage watched Rena, wiping the tears from her eyes. She'd seen them before, but hadn't truly paid attention. They weren't turquoise like everyone else. Hers were more milky and pale, but still a shade of blue. She couldn't have truly been a child of Terra. Magic passed through their line just as the mark had passed down from Miranda to Sage. Rena had been adopted, most likely, maybe even lied to her whole life. The more she learned about Rena, the more sympathy she had. Secrets were the true tragedy, and the reason for nearly all the bad deeds that had been done. Sage nearly opened her mouth to say as much, but Zack spoke before she could. A sad story, truly, but none of this makes you any less guilty of mass murder. Zack's tone had no sympathy. How can you stand here and call me a murderer? Rena demanded. How many lives have you ended, vampire? None that have brought me as much pleasure as yours will, I can assure you that. Zack slammed a fist against the magical barrier. Just as it stopped Rena from escaping, it also prevented anyone else from reaching her. Remove the magic. I'll take my justice now. She's not yours yet. Devon's voice boomed with authority. His eyes were on the move, scanning the room, focusing on the doors and taking extra time at the corners and shadowy places. Who's with you? Just me, Rena replied, backing away from the edge of the magical barrier. Zack eyed her like a lion, ready to pounce on its kill. The fangs were out, proving just how deadly his intent was. But he couldn't take his justice yet. Not that Sage considered murder justice by any stretch of the imagination. There was still one piece of the puzzle missing. They'd given the address to Ava. They'd never spoken aloud where they would be, or where their special friend was. Why did you come here? Why not go after the vampires again? Sage asked. A collective hush fell over the group as each one of them seemed to be holding their breaths in expectation of what Rena might say next. You know as well as I do that the weapon had gone missing. Rena took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. Ava had you searching for the stone. When you didn't return after your last meeting with her, I knew you found it and were most likely hiding it. No one was supposed to know the details of my mission, Gray growled defensively. Rena ignored him, keeping her eyes on Sage as she spoke. I told you, assistants know everything. And what do you think you know, little girl? Zack snarled, narrowing his eyes, that deadly gaze back on his prey. I know how the weapon kills vampires, she spat at him. She would have been dead if not for the barrier protecting her. Zack slammed against it so hard it shook the walls of Devon's office. You heard her admit it. She's guilty. She's stupid. That's all I've heard her admit so far, Devon responded with casual curiosity. So what? Were you hoping to collect an atta-girl for retrieving the weapon? It would definitely put me in Ava's good graces if I found it. Rena's tone wavered as her eyes flitted between Zack's feral gaze and Devon's calm. I've been searching ever since I lost it. I saw you pull up Miranda's records in the database, and I knew you were on the trail. And then there was this address in her trash can. Where does Ava think you are? Gray asked. She's on alert for all of her charges these days. I'm off duty right now, Rena shrugged. No one pays attention to my comings and goings. You think yourself pretty smart, don't you? I remember a girl who showed little potential when I assessed her for combat, Devon said, scrutinizing Rena's face as if trying to see past another glamour. Clearly I was deceived. That doesn't often happen. I'm not a fighter, Rena agreed. And yet you managed to massacre a vampire coven. How? Devon asked, coming as close to the magical barrier as he could without touching it. The weapon, she gulped, those milky blue eyes widening with fear. Between the vampires threatening her death and the ogre who could pummel her into oblivion, she had to know how dangerous her position was. I was able to hold it. Her voice trembled, but she continued. But anyone I showed it to became very weak. So I knew immediately that it could be used to avenge my father. You took it into a vampire den? Zack's muscles twitched as if wanting to reach out and throttle her, but his hands remained at his side. Before I learned about the seed, I had begged Ava to let me go on a mission. I didn't know that I wasn't truly one of you guys at that point. I was so eager to do my part for A.S.S.E.T, fight the good fight as my father had always done. The mission was supposed to be a show of force to stop one of the covens from killing and leaving their, she nearly retched as she said the word, victims. We don't judge, Gray said. We do what's necessary to protect the magical community. Those vampires are the reason my father was killed. He was a victim once. Her voice sounded as if she'd found strength to rise above the sorrow that she'd given into moments before. I thought we were going in to stop them, but no, we were negotiating terms with them. After that meeting, I was disgusted. But what could I do? She huffed, lifting her hand and holding the tiny garnet between her fingers. Keeping peace with killers and protecting the magical law trumped life like my father's, just as it trumps the lives of countless people who die because of those stinking leeches. You idiot, Gray shouted. If that's what you truly believe, you failed to understand our place in the world. Every day we lay down our lives to keep the peace. It's not simple, nor is it pretty, but we do what we must to avoid another magical war. Vampires kill people. How can we let that happen? Rena shot back at him just as angrily. Zach clucked his tongue. The quiet disapproval pulled more interest to him than any shouting he might have added to the already raised voices. When your diet consists of only one thing, how can you call someone evil for sustaining themselves? Murder is evil, Rena replied. When you eat meat, is that not murder? Zach scoffed. Perspective is necessary when dealing with those that are different than you. My father wasn't a cow. Rena's anger didn't abate. If your father had been turned dark, I can assure you it was because he was doing things that fell outside the realm of A.S.S.E.T's rules. Gray's voice had a deadly edge to the deceptively calm tone. Those negotiations you hated so much mean a lot to my people. We don't act against A.S.S.E.T unless provoked. I don't believe that for a second. Rena's voice sharpened. My father was a hero. He deserved to be avenged. And then the weapon came through our office. And once I saw what happened to Huckle, I knew I could use it to stop vampires from killing. That's murder. Zach whipped a finger at her. No, it's justice. She glared back at him accusingly. I was told Terras were noble and proud, the mother's answers to the horrors brought on by magic. You've yet to see the horror magic can bring, Zach threatened. Enough! Devin silenced the vampire with his booming voice. Where's the weapon now? When I got back, I thought I had put everything away without being seen, but the next day, the seed went missing. The records were locked, and the vampires retaliated. Agents were sent out and never came back. It's been going on ever since. Rena crumpled to the ground. I never meant for that. You started a chain reaction of events that could have brought back the wars of the old days. All because you wanted revenge, Gray snarled. I wanted to be one of you. Disappointment echoed in Rena's voice. Sage understood better than anyone else in the room how dubious the nature of A.S.S.E.T was. Human law and magical law being held by different standards. If given the opportunity, Sage would have avenged her mother's death too. But revenge wasn't the answer. Rena's need for vengeance had already racked up a sizable death count, from both innocent and guilty parties alike, her mother included. You're not Tara, Gray shot back at Rena. No, I'm not, thank the gods. Your people are nothing like the stories say. You don't fight against the atrocities of magic. You only throw a cloak over the ugly parts, so people are left unaware. Rena found her feet again. Her eyes were bloodshot from crying. She held up the garnet Devin had set as bait. And if this were real, I'd use it to remove the magic from all of you. Magic's not evil, Sage found herself saying before she even committed to the thought. Really? Rena's eyes narrowed on Sage. You've been wronged by every person in this room. Your own mother, I bet, didn't even tell you what you were. Secrecy is wrong. Condemning you to a life you didn't choose is wrong. She didn't condemn me to anything, Sage said. She died fighting a battle you started. Rena's contempt didn't falter. He tricked you, she pointed at Gray. He drank your blood, she threw a finger to Zach. He filled your head with false prophecy. Another finger landed at Devin. Everyone in this room has wronged you. Including you, Sage finished the sentence for her. Magic has wronged us all, Sage. I was trying to fix the wrong done to me. The wrong done to innocent people who were murdered at the hands of those vampires, like my father. She had no more tears. Her voice cracked as she spoke. I believed in what my father did. I believed the stories. My father was the knight in shining armor, the great defender of peace between the races of magic. She sniffed and wiped her face. But the truth is, he wasn't even my father. And he did little more than turn a blind eye to murder. And what did he get for his troubles? Death. I've heard enough. Zach's hungry eyes were locked on Rena's puffy face. She's admitted her crimes. I claim justice. She's not Tara, Devin said loudly. She'll bleed just the same. Zach licked his lips before sending a smirking glance at Gray. I'll make sure her body is properly disposed of so not to cause any more problems with A.S.S.E.T regulations. This wasn't how it needed to end. As angry as she was at Rena, death at the fangs of a vampire didn't feel right. Sage cringed, remembering how painful those teeth could be, and searched for something to say to stop it from happening. We don't have jurisdiction. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. Her words stopped Zach and Devin from coming to blows. A knock at the door added further distraction. Ava stood at the threshold, suited up and ready for action. Oh, good. I hope to see everyone here. Her domineering tone bordered on cocky. You shouldn't be here, Devin replied to her. You think you have the market cornered on deception? Ava shot back at him, hands on her hips, staring down at them like naughty little children. Gray, your information was an easy lie to uncover, but I commend you for the efforts. Did you really suspect me? Gray shrugged. If not you, someone in your inner circle. Yes, she scoffed, her eyes moving from one face to another. I've been looking into that myself when I saw little Rena here sneaking away. I hoped my suspicions were unfounded, but look where I found her. Ava pushed past the group and came face to face with her assistant, who was crying again. It's time she came in for questioning. She's already admitted her guilt, Sage offered. Signed, sealed, and delivered. Excellent work. I have 3 agents and a transport vehicle waiting in the parking lot. Ava cracked a wicked smile. And as for you lot, her gaze turned to Sage, let it be known that the weapon has been retrieved. She spoke the words louder than was necessary, and Sage wondered if her intent was to ensure that anyone lurking in the shadows might hear too. It's currently under armed transport with its final destination to Germany. So we should be done with all the posturing and threats. Sage's hand nearly flew to the necklace, but she stopped herself from revealing, even through body language, that Ava was lying. I wasn't told this, Zach growled angrily. He'd been so close to a meal only to be denied at the last second. Sage was all too glad not to have to witness that. I'm here as a representative for my people, he said furiously. I demand justice. It will be given publicly, Ava countered, with just as much domination in her voice. I've called for an emergency meeting of the Magical Council in this city, and Rena will be placed on trial for her crimes, with punishment to be doled out at their discretion. More tricks to protect your people's mistakes. We have the guilty party. Justice will be dealt with now. Zach never looked so deadly. Ava rose up to her full height and stared him down like an alpha wolf. It must be done publicly. This is the only way we can return to peace. This war must not happen. You all know the cost is too high for any of us to pay. Devin picked up a wrapped bundle made of dried leaves and twine and lit the end of it. As it began to smoke, Sage watched the magic of the barrier shimmer. As if burning its magic out, it grew brighter until it shattered into a glistening shower. Rena stood for a moment, as if she had seen what happened, although being human, she couldn't have. Sage scrutinized her expression and then turned back to Devin. If that is the will of A.S.S.E.T, then we can do nothing but allow it to happen. Devin agreed respectfully and made one final pass with the smoking stick, and then snuffed it out in a bowl on the desk next to Rena. Zach looked positively murderous. He'd been eager for revenge, and in one fell swoop, Ava had robbed him of it. But to his credit, he didn't make a move towards Rena as Devin worked to unravel the magic imprisoning her. Gray wasn't taking any chances. His eyes were riveted on the vampire as he gripped the handle of his machete ready to strike. Moment of truth time. If Zach wanted to, he could either have Rena's throat and a heartbeat. But he'd be stupid to try. Either Gray or Devon would end him with little more than a nod from Ava. Bloodshed was the last thing Sage wanted to see, and as angry as she was at Rena, vengeance was what had started this. It wouldn't end it. Only justice would bring peace. Her heart thrummed as she watched Zach, hoping he'd let them take Rena into custody. It was better to slink away and lick his wounds than to die a pointless death demanding satisfaction. A hand slithered down Sage's leg, and before she could react, Rena had lifted one of the knives from her belt, and the blade found her neck. The sharp edge stung, opening up the hairline slit in her skin as she gulped. I will not be murdered to please your bloodlust. Rena found her voice, loud and clear. She had both arms wrapped around Sage's neck, hugging her, making the knife press even deeper against Sage's skin. You don't want to do this, Rena, Devon cautioned. You're planning to murder me. What's my play here? Rena shrieked like a madwoman, clearly at the end of her rope. Everyone better back away nice and slow, or Sage here will be the last of her line. For a moment, no one moved. They stared at the pair, their eyes moving from Sage to Rena and back again, as if judging whether or not they should cooperate. Ava's eyes didn't quite meet Sage's as she looked at her, but her gaze went lower, as if searching for something beyond the knife at her throat. Devon was first to hold his hands up and take a non-threatening step away from Rena. You want to be a hero? He asked. You got to earn the cape. I tried being a hero, Rena spat back at him. But he hadn't been talking to her. Sage remembered Devon's promise to make her a cape when she'd proven herself. She needed to remember all the training sessions and find a way to get that knife from her throat. See what happens when you deny swift justice? Zach gnashed his teeth together as he turned towards Ava. How many more innocent deaths are going to be on your head? Ava's scrutinizing gaze remained on Sage, perhaps calculating the cost of another life to bring her assistant in for trial. Sage prayed that she'd not have to pay that price, but between Rena's grip and the bite of the blade in her neck, the situation seemed grim. Zach backed away, following Devon's lead. My people will be told what happens here tonight. See that they are well informed. This isn't over, Ava agreed. Your people will have justice. She inched back one step at a time as her eyes locked on the pair. Gray, come on, let Rena have space. Gray was the last to move, looking more reluctant than the rest. He was the only one to look Rena in the eyes as he backed away. You had other options. Why take this one? You left me only one choice. The trembling in her arms proved that Rena wasn't a fighter, but desperation made people do things, and all it would take would be a flick of her wrist to open Sage's throat. Not killing me would be a very good option, Sage said calmly as she could, though her heart was thundering loud enough to echo in her ears. We do what we have to do, Rena said, but rather than loosen her grip, when the room cleared, she pressed harder. It's not personal. Never is personal. Her throat burned as the knife's blade ripped at her neck. There would be no talking sense into this girl. All hopes for a peaceful way to avoid death trickled down her neck in a warm stream of blood. Sage sighed, knowing what she had to do. She moved quickly, lifting her hand up before Rena could react. Both of her hands tightly gripped at Rena's forearm, and she pulled sharply away from her neck. She tilted her shoulders, at the same time creating enough of a window between her and the weapon for her body to slip through and get her head free. Rena struggled to keep a hold of the knife, but Sage refused to let go of her forearm. She twisted free and let the tension of Rena's arm do the rest of the job. As sharp as it was, the knife sliced through her skin like butter. A moment of silence passed between them as the realization struck, a split second before the gasp of pain. Blood bloomed out from Rena's chest. This wasn't how it was meant to end. Sage reached out to steady her, but she was too slow. Rena crumpled to the ground with a silent moan. Blood stained her shirt as she futilely pawed at the dagger sheathed 3 inches into her chest. It was buried so deeply there'd be no removing it, and doing so would only kill her quicker. Sage fell to her knees next to Rena. You left me no choice. Rena gathered her breath and replied, Better I die this way than fall victim to a vampire. Sage should have felt satisfied. She had avenged her mother, but as she held Rena dying in her arms, all she could do was weep. She could neither hate nor love Rena for what she had done. Secrets and manipulation had twisted noble intentions into evil deeds. If not Rena, someone else might have taken up arms, feeling that they were working for justice. How many more Renas were out there? Sage could have easily fallen into the same trap. Thankfully, she was a true Terra, and the weapon that started it all was useless in her hands. She vowed then and there to never let it out of her sight. She'd take the secret of its location to her grave. No one should wield such power, no matter their intentions. Chapter 34. Ava gave the order to her agents to remove the body. She spoke with Gray, commending him for keeping a close eye on Sage. She even sounded kindly when discussing the upcoming meeting with Zach. Sage had never seen the diplomatic side of Ava. She was scarily good at it. One by one, people were talked to and sent away. When only Sage remained, Ava zeroed in on her with all the swiftness of a predator. Confidence sparkled in her eyes. Something else too, but Sage wouldn't go as far as to say pride, though they had pulled victory from the jaws of defeat. You and I share a secret now. Sage looked around the empty office, making sure that they were alone before answering. I don't know what. Ava clucked her tongue at Sage and waggled a finger. Mark assured me you were smarter than that. She knew. Sage's eyes widened as she sucked in a breath. How long did she know? The question burned on her lips, but she didn't ask it. Ava pointed her waggling finger at Sage's chest. The price of peace is often higher than we're willing to pay, but it must be paid. For that, I'm truly sorry. Miranda had sacrificed too much for peace. Sage wasn't sure she had it in her to pay that same price. My mother was a truly noble woman, Ava added with a note of reverence. She may not have a plaque to commemorate her courage, but those of us who keep the truth will always honor her memory. She was the best of us. Thank you for saying that. Sage fought against the tears. She'd cried too much already. No matter what you decide to do with your future, you must always bear the burden of that secret. Ava's tone turned serious, and I need your word on that. Sage reached for her mother's necklace. Buried beneath her shirt, the silver had warmed to the temperature of her skin, and she fingered the outline of the tree pendant. My mom told me to keep this close, so I would always feel her presence. Of that, I have no doubt. And I will take that as your solemn oath? Sage nodded. She would keep it close and guard its secret in her hands. It was little more than a trinket in her hands, its power neutralized, and with no one the wiser to its location, it was safe from the destructive forces of its tempting justice. You have a choice now, one I feel you might need some time to consider. Ava placed a hand on Sage's shoulders. She took a breath, pausing as if struggling to find the right words. For a woman who wore her power like a second skin and strutted around with unchecked confidence, Ava's hesitation spoke more truth than the words that would come from her mouth. Go home. Think about your future, and if you feel that I have earned your trust, come back, become an agent, and work with me at A.S.S.E.T. It's hard to know who to trust with all the lies and manipulation I've dealt with so far, Sage replied calmly. The offer sounded genuine, and she would go home and think about it. You'll learn. Trust comes from actions, not ass-kissing. Those that you can truly trust might anger you at times, but they'll always have your back, no matter the cost. Ava's hands fell from Sage's shoulder. She remembered her mother's final words. When the time comes, you'll understand why I had to remain silent. But know that I have never left you vulnerable, and even in my absence, I've thought of your protection. Her mother had surrounded her with the best A.S.S.E.T had to offer. Mark understood what needed to be done. He had sent her to Ava, who had ordered Gray to be her shadow, and despite her efforts to shake him, Gray hadn't left her side, faithful to his mission, despite his obvious dislike of Sage. Even placed in the path of Zach and Devon, Sage had been surrounded by people who wouldn't harm her. It had been manipulation of the worst kind, but done out of respect to the sacrifice her mom had made. Sage wasn't sure how long she'd been standing there stupidly staring off into space. When she blinked back to reality, she found Ava staring at her, arms crossed as if waiting for a reply. Thank you? Sage mumbled, still not able to make the comment Ava clearly wanted. When you're ready to take the oath, I'll see you in my office. Ava wore the satisfied grin of a woman who'd just gotten what she wanted. Until then, dismissed. And that is the end. We made it. Yay! So was anybody surprised about it being Rena? Let's check the comments and see what you guys have said. I know this was a really, really long reading today, but I wanted to finish it before the end of the year. So let's see. Poke the bear, get him. Semi nailed it. So Regine, you had an idea that it was possibly Rena. I'm surprised we don't have Joe here today, because I know he would never stop gloating if he was here. So I'm sure I will hear about it later. So yes, it was Rena the whole time. And I hope you guys really, really enjoyed it. I'm sorry I went over this time, but like I said, I really wanted to get it finished before the end of the year. And there is a poll in my Facebook group. And if you want to vote on it, please do. Then we will start a new Storytime Sunday with the new year in 2021. So thank you again for hanging out with me. Thank you for following along with the whole book. I love you guys, and I will see you again soon. Happy New Year.